interesting week for the show continues. We had Commissioner Howard Safer on last episode, only man to ever been commissioner of both the FDNY and the NYPD, held the roles consecutively. So if you haven't checked out that episode, that was episode 207 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Please go do so. He was very candid. He was a great interview. He gave me a lot. So I really enjoyed that chat with him. And I'm sure I'll enjoy tonight's chat. Excuse me. This is episode 208 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Welcome, everybody, to those of you tuning in via YouTube and LinkedIn tonight. I appreciate it as always. And I think it's going to be a great show with my next guest, who for 16 years at both the state and city level worked in the ever-evolving world of New York City law enforcement, a corrections officer to start, NYPD detective to finish, with a stop in Florida as a sheriff's deputy in between. He's also an instructor, passing a combined 2 decades of knowledge to fellow cops as they investigate the same crimes he once did. And that tonight, for episode 208 of the Mike the New Haven podcast, is retired NYPD detective John Baeza. John, welcome. How are you?
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And I appreciate you being here. And if you guys, of course, have a question for John, it's fired away. I see my friend Bill Ryan, of course, in the chat, and Scotty Wagner's here as well, an old friend of yours. He's tuning in tonight. Hey, Scotty, good to see you as always, brother. So, John, tell me about where you grew up.
Actually, I was born in Staten Island, and I spent about 10 years living in Chester, New York. My father was a lieutenant in the fire department. When he retired, essentially, I grew up in a town of 150 people in Pennsylvania. So I was kind of a country boy, and I developed a taste for wanting to serve in the city.
Of course, the city always intrigues anybody, no matter where you grow up, in a city or in a smaller town. So you mentioned he was a fire lieutenant. Did you lean towards the fire department at first?
I didn't. I was a big reader when I was a kid, and I went to the library. We didn't have Amazon then, and read a lot of books about NYPD cops, and both my grandfathers were retired NYPD, and I had a hankering. I said, I would like to be a cop and keep it in the family, the tradition, and that's really what I wanted to do all along.
And you got the chance to do that. Of course, you get onto the job in 1984, and it's a great place to start. I say that great and not great. It's not great because the crime's through the roof, but it's great if you want to hone your skills and really make an effective street cop, because there's a lot to do. Where was your first NSU?
My first NSU in the police department was NSU 2, down in Lower East Side.
Lower East Side, great place to start, of course. And we're going to get to that in a second. I'm going to go back to that. But I should go back a little bit, because 1984, you actually come on to corrections. I mentioned you were a CO when I was introducing you. And again, that's an interesting place to start as well, because it's one thing to get these guys off the street and put them in. Now you got to guard them once they're in. So tell me about becoming a CO.
Well, I'll tell you, I had graduated high school in June, and at the end of July, I was in the Correction Academy, and before you know it, I was working at Sing Sing. And I can always remember the first day that I arrived there. It was dark. It was early morning. It was dark, and I was pulling up, and I looked at these walls, 30, 40 feet high, whatever they were, and I was like, oh my gosh, what am I got myself into? I'm 18 years old, and they changed the age limit after that. But I got in at 18, and I knew I was going on the correction department. I wanted to do my best, but also I knew that the pension counted towards the police department. So I figured, let me spend some time there. And I'll tell you, it was one heck of an experience.
Did you start in Sing Sing?
Yeah, I started at Sing Sing, and I really enjoyed it. It was a very long drive I was allowed to live out of state too. Imagine that. I was living in Pennsylvania, and I traveled to Sing Sing every day, and it was just a long, long ride. But I loved it after. When I got there, you get to love the guys and the gals you work with. And, if somebody at Sing Sing had 3 years on a job, that was as if they had 20 years on a job, because Sing Sing a lot of people just, rotated in and out there. Nobody wanted to be there, really. But I did. I liked it. And I worked there, and all the inmates there were violent felons. It's not like we had medium security or whatever. We had violent felons, and that had done some heinous acts. There was several cop killers we had in there. So Yeah, it was a as an 18-year-old kid to process it all. It was difficult, but somehow I managed to do it, even though I was scared every day. I mean, I still was scared every day, even when I was a cop. I'm scared every day, but it kept me on my toes.
I was going to say the fear does keep you honest. A healthy amount of fear does keep you honest, because if there's no fear, that's how guys and gals end up getting hurt in any job, in any profession, in the first responder field, but especially a profession like that. But what helps you keep it in check, or at least what helped you back then?
Back then, what helped me the most, people might laugh, was that I was courting or dating my first wife. So that was a little bit of, kind of a diversion on my days off. And, I was kind of head over heels, if you will. And that kind of took a little bit of it gave me a diversion, because if I didn't have a diversion, if I didn't have that, um, you know, I, I would have stuck it out because I wanted to do it. But there were times when I was in there, I was thinking to myself, they'd lock you in, and I had friends who were going, they were going to college and they wanted to meet up, and I said, listen, I got overtime, I can't go, and they're like, they're in college parties and stuff like this, and I'm like, nope, I can't do it. And lock the gate behind you. That's back, we didn't have electric stuff, so when they lock that gate behind you and you got overtime, well, you've got overtime.
And that probably saved you back then, because you know how wild college parties can get and out of control they can get.
Yeah. I know they can get out of control.
So yeah, you probably avoided problems by not going. Detective John Baeza, retired NYPD Detective John Baeza, is our guest tonight on the Mike the New Haven podcast. Let me shout out everybody. I did mention Bill Ryan, of course, and Scotty Wagner, and he mentioned Stu Kelsall and Jay Driscoll, who were across the pond in England, tuning in tonight. I appreciate you guys being here. Steven Soslavsky, who's a commissioner with the New Haven Fire Department, my neck of the woods, of course, my hometown. He's here. Joe Malika, another former CO. Billy Kennedy, retired sergeant out of the NYPD's Elite Emergency Service Unit. Darren Phillips, and Raquel Pranzo, who is the better half of retired NYPD street crime lieutenant and author Pete Pranzo. Thank you guys, of course, and as always, for tuning in tonight. So, I was talking about this with my buddy Bob Starkman a while ago, another former CO, and he later went out to U.S. Customs. A CO's greatest weapon, you guys do have the clubs. I don't think you carry guns. I know the Special Operations Contingent does. I think the Emergency Service Unit, or your equivalent of ESU, does. But the regular COs don't. Your greatest weapon, as Bob was telling me, and tell me if you agree with this, was your mind.
Yeah, and you're correct, Bob. Was your mind? I mean, you carried a nightstick back then, but that was of no help. I mean, if the inmates wanted to take over, they could. I knew a couple of guys from the year before that had been involved in the riot and had been taken hostage and so forth. And they told their story. Of course, it made it much more scarier every time you went in there. But it was, you had to use your mind more. You had to learn how to talk to people. I grew up in a small town, so I expected, if I told somebody something, that they were going to do it, because here I am, a correction officer, right? I'm a peace officer status. Well, that wasn't the way it went, and I learned real quick that you need to know how to talk to people, and and how to persuade them rather than antagonize them.
Of course, and I will say, you later went out to Otisville, and no prison's easy to work in, because any inmate, even if it's a low security prison, these people aren't necessarily in there for serious offenses of either the white collar or the violent variety. You turn your back for a second, somebody can go crazy. Somebody can try to do something to you one way or the other and get one over on you. But nevertheless, after starting out in Sing Sing, Otisville had to be a piece of cake for you.
Yeah, it was. In fact, the way I got a day shift, I wanted to work the day shift, and the way I got it was, there was a housing unit there. It's basically like a dormitory, and nobody wanted it because it was like the worst one and so forth. So I said, I'll bid it. When you bid it, you have it. Nobody can take it away. So I bid it, and I got day shift. And in that unit is where I used a lot of my verbal skills, and a lot of skills I used on the police department later came from Sing Sing and Otisville, especially. I learned how to talk. You're in close quarters. There's no cells, but you learn to talk to these criminals who have, some of them were child abusers. Some of them were just more medium security inmates. But instead of instead of telling somebody something, I would always say, gentlemen, do me a favor, count time, you know. And once you talk like that, I mean, people might laugh at it, but once you start talking like that, the inmates, you know, they listen to you. I think they were gentlemen? No, of course not. But I use that term, and you know, it works, and it worked very well at Otisville. Um, and the reason I went to Otisville, the only reason was I could not drive any. It was like a 2-hour drive back and forth to Sing Sing. So Otisville was 20 minutes, and like you said, it was a piece of cake, but you still had to be on your toes, and there was still weapons and shanks found, and that I found, you know. So you always had to be careful about that.
No, of course. And yeah, I can't imagine making that commute to and fro every day, man. No wonder you switched out. I don't blame you one bit. But you know, you've seen it. If you treat these guys with the modicum of respect, well, you've seen instances and stories where a CO is getting attacked, and the inmates come to his defense. They help the guy out against another inmate. And why is that? He probably or she probably treated them with respect previously, and they return the favor.
You're right, and I don't want to skip forward, but when I worked as a deputy in the jail for a little while in Florida, it happened with me. You know, I was involved in helping somebody, and I got sprayed by mistake. You know, and you can't see when you get sprayed with the OC, and it was an inmate that took me over to the sink and tried to flush my eyes out and so forth because, you know, I had given respect. You know.
Yeah, and there was a story I was talking about this with Commissioner Safer previously, where you know a couple of things. I brought up Kevin Gillespie, who was killed in the line of duty in 1996. That was one of the things that was said in his obituary. He treated everybody he arrested with respect, and you know, I think even some of the guys he put away at some point came out to his funeral because that's how much respect they had for him. And Commissioner Safer also mentioned something Commissioner Bratton brought about, and I know this is true. You guys were doing it way before it was ever even coined. Verbal judo.
Yeah, I mean, people will laugh at it. I took a course when I took a 1-day course, I guess, in the police department. Everybody took it, verbal judo at some point. And you know, as a cop, you kind of cynical to everything as a street cop. But later on, I purchased the book, you know, to look at it, and I just said to myself, I wish I had read this book and paid attention years ago to the verbal judo, and it really, as funny as the name sounds, it really does work. So
it does.
I enjoyed that.
It does, because look at how many incidents have been avoided. It doesn't get reported as much, but there's a lot of incidents that have been able to be resolved peacefully. Even something as simple, I covered this in my emergency service unit, and I shouldn't say it's simple because it's anything but emergency, but in my emergency service unit miniseries, when they're talking somebody down from the bridge, think about how precarious that is. Verbal judo doesn't just have to work in a high leverage situation. It could work anywhere. And that's how police and community relations really, you know, are able to ferment themselves for the better.
Yeah, I agree. And then those emergency service guys are unbelievable. You know, the hostage negotiation team and how well they're trained and the job they do to save people. It's just amazing, and I have the utmost respect for those guys.
Absolutely, myself is included, obviously, and I have that mini series on them. It's called the E-Men inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit. Shameless plug time if you want to check that out on my channel. I have a question here from Stu Kelsaw. It's a good one, and he says, "In your experience, talking about your years as a CO, how successful do you feel the prison service is in regards to rehabilitation?"
Well, I answer every question honestly, so I'm going to tell you that I don't think the prison system does very well on rehabilitation. In fact, you know, I'd give them an F probably. Not enough. There's not enough money, and nobody's going to spend it in corrections. But there needs to be more programs. One thing, one bright spot. I'll try not to be the cynic. One bright spot I noticed when I was at Otisville is they trained some. Now you remember some of these guys are medium security, but they train these guys on how to drive the 18-wheelers and get their license, so that when they got out, they could get a job, and they work with them to try to get them a job. So I thought that was pretty. You know, not to be, like I said, to find a good point, I would say that was pretty good. You know.
Yeah, there's ways to reduce recidivism, real ways, I believe, but as you said, they just don't put enough money into it. and that's a debate that'll go on till the end of time as to why or why not. But I do appreciate you answering that question candidly. That's a great question from you, Stu, and I appreciate you for submitting it. So that brings us to 1987, where you do get onto the NYPD, and finally you achieve your dream. And you started out, like you said earlier, in the Lower East Side. And again, going to Sing Sing, having your experiences there, then Otisville. Now you're on the Lower East Side. It's a different kind of jungle. But tell me about, the culture shock it was, if any at all, from being a CO on the inside to now being out on the street.
Oh, there's definitely a culture shock, and remember, I'm still from a small town too. I mean, I grew up pretty quickly, and I don't know about mature, but I kind of got hardened pretty quickly. But when the reason I worked at NSU too is I moved from Pennsylvania to my grandmother's house in Staten Island. So I stayed there during the academy, so they assigned me to something close to Staten Island. So I worked there, and I liked it. I thought it was exciting. There was some good places to eat, but there was a lot. There was, back then in the 80s, there was a lot of crack sales. It was one of my first arrests. There was a lot of violence in the 9th precinct, and I had a lot of respect again for the fight 9th, but it didn't prepare me at all for what I came to when I came to the 3-2.
I imagine. And again, getting to the 3-2, this is, for those of you that don't understand, the New York City Police Department may not be familiar. Every precinct, if they've ever lost a cop or even just an alumni of the precinct who's passed away, they have a memorial wall. But it's usually for officers from that precinct who have been killed in the line of duty. The 3-2 has the most memorial plaques on their wall, and they just added 2 more this past January when Detectives Rivera and Mora were shot and killed in line of duty on a domestic dispute call. So there's a lot of good men that have been lost from that precinct over the years. And I imagine walking in there, seeing that in the first day, even though you didn't need the reminder from your years as a CO, it drove that point home even further.
Yeah, correct. When I opened those big, the brass doors in the precinct, and I looked and I saw that wall, and I was like, wait a second, this is not the 9th. There's 27 or 26 names or plaques on that wall. That's by far the most in the city. And I knew I was in a special place. Now, my father told me he was a fireman, but he worked in 58 engine on the upper, in East Harlem. But he had told me, he said, you're going to the king of precincts. And I was like, okay. And he was right. But I remember going up to the desk the first day, and one of the old timers, I was wearing a long trench coat, and one of the old timers said, "Hey kid, what are you doing wearing your father's coat?" And I knew from then it was kind of, but it was good. And that was he passed on now. That was I think his name was Ed Gridley, real old timer, but a good guy. I became very good friends with him. That place, I have respect for everybody that I work for, and I feel that I worked, as the saying goes, on the shoulders of giants. Mm-hmm. Some of these guys, Tom Kennedy, Tom Barrett, Terry McGee, they just, my partner Saul Brew. These guys were just special men, and there were some women that worked there too, but they were very special men that worked there at that time, and I was proud to have worked there, because in that precinct, you basically, it's a less than 1 square mile, so you're kind of, when you're backing somebody else, you're in everybody else's business sometimes, so you basically know you're good cops, you're bad cops. But I'll tell you what, we had all good cops, never a hint of corruption, never a hint of brutality. And I really, truly mean that. And I was blessed to work during a time when that went on. There were guys like I told you about, Kennedy and Barrett and McGee. McGee was shot and he was saved by his belt buckle. And Kennedy and Barrett were there. And I believe, from what I understand, is they tackled the guy. They didn't shoot him or anything. And this was thought of as a great, brave thing at the time. Now people would probably say, well, why didn't you shoot him or whatever? But these guys were great, great men. And I learned a lot from them, and it helped me throughout my career.
Was Eddie Hartnett there at the same time you were?
Who?
Eddie Hartnett, you know him?
No, I know of him. I don't. He wasn't at the 3-2 when I was there, but I know of
Okay.
him. Yeah.
Another former 3-2 cop who went on to
Yeah.
do great things in the department, became the police commissioner later on in Yonkers as well. And he's been on this show. Good guy, good friend of mine. So it really was. I mean, Howard Safer, and when I had him on the previous episode, he said that running the NYPD was like running an army, and you guys are the soldiers in that army. And it was really war on the streets during that time. So much was going on. As you said, you hit the nail on the head with the crack. You got these dealers, they're soldiers in their own war too. And the enemy lines have been drawn, and you guys are waging that battle with them. Tell me about, even though you're on patrol, maybe you're not doing it like street crime is or the detective bureau is with the long form investigations. The first collar starts with patrol. So tell me about, not only keeping your head on a swivel back then, but also still utilizing that verbal judo, not just to get out of situations, but to get collars too.
Oh yeah. I mean, it was. It took me a little bit of time on learning on the street. It was a little different than the jail, but it took me a little bit of time. But I learned how to talk to people, and how to settle disputes and so forth without resorting to any kind of violence. Because you'd go on 30, 35 calls a night, whatever, 35 jobs a night, and a lot of them would be man with a gun. They'd be robbery. There'd be heavy duty jobs you'd be called on. And, some of these, you had so many calls that you had to get these things done. And sometimes they were done without an arrest being made. Sometimes they were done with just talking and, somebody understanding, saying they understood, or they understood where you were coming from, and kind of a mutual respect at that time. I mean, sometimes you didn't have that. In the 3-2 was very, very difficult, but you did learn a lot, and you did learn a lot about, you got to remember, I was a cop. I'm a 20, 21 years old, and we're heading to disputes where 50-year-olds are involved, and it's like, you learn, you got to learn real quickly. And the thing is, the people I work with are the people who are special, because I learned so much from them, so much, all kinds of nuggets I got. I listened to them, and throughout my career, I'll never forget those guys in the 3-2, and they inspired me to do much better in narcotics and special victims, and that's just the truth of the matter.
We're talking with Detective John Baeza here on the Mike New Haven podcast. John had an interesting career between corrections, the NYPD, and even a stop in Florida as a sheriff's deputy, as we'll discuss later on. And it's very poignant that you say that, because again, as I said earlier, sometimes the higher crime areas, the higher crime precincts, are where the best cops that you've ever seen in the city have come from. You see that in Brooklyn too, with the 7-5. Although I had to imagine, this is all due respect to the 7-5, we'll give you 22 minutes. You give us 22 minutes, we'll give you a homicide. That's the saying. I almost butchered it. When they had the reputation, I think they still do, as being the most violent precinct in the city. But I think at that point in time, late 80s, early 90s, at the peak of the crack wars, you guys have to be looking at that saying, hello, have you seen our territory lately?
Yeah, I think, Mike, per capita, and Louis Animone would know, Chief Animone would know, but I think per capita, the 3-2 was probably the most violent precinct, because we were less than 1 square mile. 7-5 is 5 square miles. Mm-hmm. The 3-4 is whatever 4 or 5 square miles it was. So we would have, I guess we'd have about 70, 80 homicides a year, I'd say. Mm-hmm. That's a lot for less than 1 square mile.
Very much so. A lot of bloodshed going on. There's somebody who's LinkedIn user here saying hi, John, but that LinkedIn user I checked is one Irma Rivera. She's watching tonight.
Oh, she is. We could talk about, when we get to the special victims, we'll talk about her, but she is she's one of those giants that I, rode on the shoulders of, and what a great detective, great investigator, and a great person she is.
Yep. So. Yep, I can attest to that. She's a good friend of mine as well. Always a pleasure interacting with her. She's really one of the great ones, as you said. So that brings us to 1991 and going into the narcotics unit. There's so much to do in narcotics at the time, as we covered as well. And really, if you can stop drug dealers, and by extension drug dealers, from going down, you can probably stop homicides, because a lot of the homicides that were happening during that time, at least a good portion of them, were tied directly to the drug trade. So given how prevalent it was, and obviously seeing it in full effect as a cop in the 3-2. Is that what made you want to go there?
That I'll tell you the truth. That not necessarily what made me want to go. Again, I'm honest about my my career, but what made me want to go was one day I'll make it kind of brief. But one day I was down at Bellevue, and I needed a ride back up to the precinct. But back then you're in uniform, and sometimes you got to take the bus or the train or whatever. And a guy came up to me, and I looked at him. He didn't look like any cop to me, but he showed me his shield. He said, "Listen, I'm going up to Manhattan North Narcotics up at 3-2, by the 3-2, and I'll take you up." So I did, and he was an undercover, and he told me different tales and things that he did and how he worked and stuff like that. And I said, you know what? I always try to conquer something. It was always my idea to conquer something that was dangerous. And I said, well, undercover work's probably one of the most dangerous types of work in the police department, which I still believe it is. And so I joined as an undercover, not necessarily to get my detective shield earlier, but just because of the stories. And I said, that's a challenge, being an undercover, a real undercover, no ID, that kind of thing. And I went, and I was proud of myself there, because in the 3-2, I thought of myself as more of maybe a mediocre cop. I mean, I tried my best, don't get me wrong, but these guys, I work with fantastic guys. But when I went to Narcotics, I did feel very confident in what I did, and I think I did it very well. I was a good actor, is what it was. And you only get one take in these scenes. But I was a good actor. I made hundreds of buys, and and that led me eventually to get moved to the major case unit of Manhattan North Narcotics.
Before I continue, Laura Berger says, "Hi, John. Long time no see. You're looking great."
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you, Laura, for tuning in. I appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed, Laura, go ahead and subscribe. I'm just saying, while you're here, it would help the channel a lot. Just putting it out there, shameless plug. I got to take advantage of them while I can. So, with that, it's not just going after the dealers, it's going after the buyers too. You see it so much. These things often involve the buyers. And it's not a malicious thing per se, because listen, it is an eyesore in the community. I personally, and I know you do too, to an extent, you do feel bad for these people, because they're really spiraling out of control and they need help in the worst way. But if you want to get the big fish, you got to start with the goldfish, and the buyers are a key source to doing that. Some of them even help up, wind up, I should say, helping you in these cases. So tell me about, we'll get to the dealers in a second, but just targeting the buyers first.
A lot of times, because I was a buyer myself. So if I was, if I had seen somebody else purchase drugs, or I was in an apartment, inside an apartment, which is pretty dangerous kind of buy. But if I was inside an apartment and there were people that came up that were, just users basically, I mean, I had to report it, and they might get arrested, and they would get arrested. And oftentimes what they try to do is, flip people. That would be the investigators, the guys who could show their face and so forth. And I work with great ones and great backup investigators. And they would, try to flip them, make them a CI, a confidential informant, and then, get work them and see if we could get a search warrant or search warrants for different locations. And then, again, the buyer would lead to possibly to a bigger fish. And typically in undercover work, you make some street buys. There weren't that a lot of undercovers did not make a lot of apartment buys, inside buys, because they would be with the scale. You'd buy, and I purchased, a kilo of cocaine, guns. And a lot of this stuff I did. I mean, just because of the way I was at the time, I initiated stuff. I'd ask people, and I went with the background that I was a long haul trucker. So a lot of times nobody asked me to use the substance, because they told them I don't use anything. I sell this out in Ohio. Anyway, the story, they believed the story. I never had anybody that didn't believe it. But
it's very believable.
We would work our way up, and a big case for me would be a couple of guns and maybe a couple of kilos of cocaine. and that or heroin, and that would be a big case that I would work on maybe long term.
Yeah, because I was gonna say, during that time, sometimes you take these dealers off the street and they're moving a lot of product. You think they're in business for themselves. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they're a small cog as a part of a larger machine, and there's a whole syndicate operating in that given area. And sometimes, listen, this is Harlem. That's basically, I can say this because I'm Dominican, so my family's in that area. Washington Heights, it's Dominican Republic South. They're going back and forth from DR back to the city and to and fro, vice versa, moving the product. So tell me, was there a specific syndicate that was operating in that area at the time that you guys had to contend with?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the DEA had identified it as drug trafficking organization of several different Dominican drug dealers that were high level. And what would happen would be they would get their cocaine from the Colombians in Queens. Colombians had a lot of it stored out there, so forth. They would get the cocaine, and then that would be the Washington Heights, the 343334 precinct. That would be the area where everybody goes to get their cocaine. People from, people who deal in the South Bronx or Harlem or whatever, they get their cocaine and want to cook it up as crack, whatever. They're getting it from Washington Heights. People from Jersey, it spread to Rhode Island, but Washington Heights was the main area. And it was a Dominican neighborhood. So, I mean, obviously, you're going to have Dominican drug organizations working there. And, we worked several of them. And, you only get so high up. I remember, we're going to Major Case a little bit now, but I remember Major Case, I think a big bus would be like, I don't know, 11, 15 kilos.
That's a lot.
Somebody's trunk. It's a lot, but then you think about, they might go at the Queens in a warehouse and seize, 3,000 kilos, So, but we did the best we could under the circumstances, and I don't want to get into it much, but I lost a lot of faith as an undercover. I lost a lot of faith in the drug war overall. Not the drug warriors or anything, but the overall drug war. Really, I didn't see the. I was very frustrated with it. Let's put it that way. And
You're not the only one. You're not the only one, because it's funny. Like I mentioned this before, you'll watch an old episode of Cops, and they're going. It's like 6 cops going after this one guy, and thinking, "What did he do?" And I'm not saying this is good, obviously, but the guy has a little bit of weed on him. I'm just for that, and I get your point. That's not for us to litigate here.
It's not something I just want to. And that frustration led me. Now I don't want to. It's your interview, but that frustration led me into special victims. And can I explain a little bit how? Because people,
this is not my interview. This is your interview. Go ahead.
Well, I got 2 interviews for the organized crime DETF, Drug Enforcement Task Force. Back then, before 9/11, that was probably the most elite task force. You get a car, you don't have to pay the toll, good overtime, And word goes around a couple weeks before the orders come out, and word was I was going to go to the DETF. And because of my frustration, I wanted to work with victims who I knew, like real live victims. And I had thought about it a lot, and I said, I'd really like to go to special victims. That's a good it was, at the time, I think it was Sex Crime Squad, but it changed. But anyway, that's where I wanted to go. And I went upstairs and I talked to my lieutenant, who happened to be Kieran Timoney, and his brother, John Timoney, I think at the time might have been chief of department.
I think so, yeah.
And so I said to him, listen, I was polite, of course. I said, Lieutenant, I don't want to go there. And he told me, he said, you're probably the first person that ever said no to this. And he said, you worked hard for me, very hard the whole time. Where do you want to go? And I said, well, I'd like to go to Special Victims Squad. And that's not a big ask at that time, because it didn't have the eliteness even though it was, I think, elite at that time. It didn't have the eliteness it does now because of the TV show. So he told me, he said, yeah. And I was like, oh, well, how is he going to do it? Yeah, I was kind of thinking, I wasn't even, the guy's brother is chief of department, So 2 weeks later, it comes down and I get transferred over to the Manhattan Special Victims Squad. And, that was the most intense. I only spent 6 years there. I broke my leg before I got off the job. I was at the state police giving a sex crime seminar with my partner, and I broke my leg, and that was it. It was broken in a couple places. But those 6 years were the most intense for me. And they were also where I learned the most about the people I were chasing. And not into the mind of like a rapist, but getting into the perspective, getting into like, what is a psychopath? Because sex crimes, if you don't put the guy away, he's going to commit it again. Just like pedophilia or the older guys who go 13-year-old kids and up. It was like hebephilia, it's called. But they're gonna offend again. So you have to take them off the streets, and you got to do it the right way. So when you go to court, your case is, there's a lot of responsibility here. This is way different than narcotics, and you're responsible for a victim. Now, homicide guys are responsible totally for the victim because they speak for the victim. But I have a living victim who depends on me to do a proper investigation and to find the guy who did it. And I spent many, many hours on my own time at the New York Academy of Medicine library. There was a bunch of doctors up there, and you could order journals. There was no like internet, so to speak, back then. So you could order journal articles, book stuff, and they had stuff on psychopaths and serial killers and serial rapists and so forth. And some of it was junk, but I got a lot of good stuff out of it. But I spent a lot of my time studying that, and it helped me a great deal when interviewing offenders. So, the amount of studying I did, the self-study I did, I think it helped me and helped my job. And it helps me to this day when I teach.
Sometimes it's better not to get inside their minds because their mind is not the mind of a normal person, obviously, to do something like that. It's one thing to be a criminal. It's one thing to be a criminal and a sexual deviant on top of that. But to at least understand the concept to an extent of why they're a sexual deviant, well, it's a big help.
Yeah, and when you interview some of these guys, pedophiles, Irma would know this, but sometimes you go in there and you basically kind of side with them when you're doing the interview. Now, you don't want to side with them. You want to, try to beat the crap out of them, but
yeah,
that's not what you do. So you get out of the interview, and I always felt like filthy, like I got to take a shower. But what you really did is, if you got the confession proper way, is you now have a 4-year-old, or not 4-year-old, but maybe 7-year-old child that doesn't have to testify, or a 10-year-old, or even an adult that doesn't have to maybe testify now because you did the right thing and you got the confession the proper way. There are other aspects of special victims that were very interesting to me, and I was involved in investigating or assisting with about 300 arrests of women and men for false reports while I was there. So I would say about 20% of my cases were false reports, but 80% were real. So when I talked to my victims who were attacked, and I asked them about this, I said, what do you feel about this false reporting thing? And I thought, they knew that it takes manpower away and so forth, especially if you say you were raped in Central Park or something like that.
Right.
And they were furious about it. They said, no, they should be arrested. And back then we had Linda Fairstein was a sex crimes prosecutor. Mm-hmm. And if you had a full confession and it made sense, and there was no hunch, it was definitely, you had it, or you had evidence, you had a confession, you would arrest the false reporter, male or female. I've arrested both.
Yeah,
and that was a very interesting part of my career. and it was influenced by detective I worked with, my partner, John Savino, because he was excellent at picking out false reports. So I learned from him. In fact, he, and I got to talk about him for 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
One time a couple came down from Canada. Irma will know this better than I do, the story, because I wasn't there. But I know a couple came down from Canada, and they said that their child was kidnapped in the middle of Central Park in the middle of the day, and nobody really believed them. The homicide went in to speak to them, and and then my partner, John Savino, said, "Can I talk to the woman?" And he went in there, and 20 minutes later, he comes out and he's got a detailed drawing of where the baby was dumped dead in Canada. So how did he do that? Well, it was rather simple, but he had to explain it to me. What he did was the lady had all her baggage behind her, man's baggage, her baggage, everything. So he figured, well, they're bringing the child in. He said, "How long are you staying?" "I don't know, a week and a half, 2 weeks, right? Could you go in the luggage and just show me the clothes for the baby?" And she broke down because there were no clothes in there. And they had left the baby, and they had killed the baby first and then dumped it on the side of a road in Canada. So this is a detective that I picked as my partner. When I went there, I looked at all the case files, and there's great detectives there. And I've worked closely with Irma and another guy, Jimmy Flaherty, great guy. And there were others before them that were great. But I picked John Savino out because I knew that he was the best at what he did. And I would sit in on interviews with him. He would let me sit in, and I'd watch how he interviews somebody. And, my boss, who I give a great shout out to, is Sergeant Eugene Wazalewski. One of my best bosses ever. He, he could see, he knew when, he knew if he had a good detective or not, and who worked and who didn't work and so forth. And I think Irma would probably agree with that. And to have a boss like that behind you on this kind of stuff is very comforting to know that you have this boss kind of behind you. And when there were sometimes, and I'm flattered by this, but at the same time I know I was pretty good at what I did. Sometimes one time I was down at court, and the sergeant said, "Listen, forget court, put the DI on the phone. I'm going to cancel your court. You're going to the 9th precinct because you got to look at this possible, could be a pattern, serial rapist, and see if this is the guy, if he's connected or not." So when I went to that particular apartment, I went in and I looked at the crime scene, and I saw that from the top shelf of where they kept like china and stuff like that, it was on the floor, but it wasn't broken, So something's odd here, right? So I asked, when I interviewed the victim, alleged victim, she said the guy came in through the bedroom, jumped on the bed, then he came down and he put something to her throat, and the razor to her throat, and kind of slashed her. She had a cut, but it looked to me that the cut, not on her throat, on her face, the cut looked like a nail cut to me. So when I went and I looked at I went up the stairs, after the crime scene had photoed it. I went up, I kind of reconstructed it. There was no lump on the bed where the guy, and also the window that supposedly was open had spider webs on it. So it wasn't open. So then I went to the emergency room, and the emergency room doctor told me, "Yeah, I think it might be from a razor blade, this cut." And I was like, "Okay." I took a picture of it. I went back. I talked to the girl. She was a younger girl, and she thought she was pregnant, and made up a story about somebody coming in and attacking her. And this took a lot of time. It took a lot of effort. We could have been working on another case, a real case, but that became kind of the subspecialty for me. I guess people that knew me from Special Victims might know that. that became kind of a little bit of a specialty for me. But at the same time, I will tell you that while I might claim that think I'm competent in sex crimes, I had some unsolved cases, like the Upper East Side rape case. There were 16 victims and DNA, and I didn't catch the guy. Me and my partner, we both caught several of the cases that were linked, believe it or not, and we worked on it. And yeah, so you get sad and you get frustrated. I still blame myself, thinking, what did I do, or what didn't I do? What did I miss? But that's the way it goes, yes.
I just want to go back a second to a couple of things just to round out the narcotics aspect, because there's a couple of questions in the chat and I don't want to ignore them, from Alicia B and Stu Kelsaw. And the first one comes from Alicia, and she says, what were your scariest and or most rewarding undercover incidents?
I have several. I had several buys where guns were present, where I wouldn't take a gun into. And if I had to make a buy in an apartment, these are the buys that were the most dangerous. I wouldn't take my gun because they pat you down. And I know my gun works. It wasn't official regulation NYPD gun, but I know my gun works. And they'll take it and hold it, even if they believe that you're not a cop. And then they'll give it back to you before you leave. But I didn't want them having my gun, so I didn't carry a gun. I was unarmed. But I'd go inside, and sometimes there would be, guys would walk around with guns sticking out and so forth. So it would get me, it would rattle me a little bit. Yeah, sure. But my last buy was the worst one of all, and I was supposed to buy $16,000 worth of heroin from a guy, and I went up to an abandoned building up in Harlem to the 4th floor, and as soon as we got to the 4th floor, I could feel like a gut feeling something's wrong, and he turned around, and I knew it was a real gun because I felt it on my forehead. And he came up and he jumped at me and put it right at my forehead. And he kept telling me, turn around. And in my gut, just at that moment, I thought, you know what? He can't shoot me in the face. He needs to shoot me in the back. And we had a little bit of a struggle. Like I tried to grab it or push away or whatever. And he ran down the stairs. He jumped into a car and got away. And then eventually he was caught. They interviewed him, and he didn't know I was a cop. And he said, yeah, what's another, this is exactly what he said. What's another dead white boy up in Harlem, So his intention was to shoot, but he couldn't shoot me in the face. So that was very scary. I think that was my worst moment in narcotics, and maybe the worst moment of my career.
Thankfully, you got out okay. And before I get to my question, Stu Kelsaw, was there much of a relationship in the way of intel from the FBI, CIA, and I'll throw the DEA in there too, in relation to out-of-state and international drug trafficking, like what we were talking about earlier with the DR?
Yeah. We actually, in Major Case Unit, Manhattan North, we actually would be called down to the DEA building and the DEA task force, or DEA, even if it wasn't the task force, it was just DEA agents. And they would always ask us to help them find a trap in a car. A trap is a location that's hidden, that's put in a car. And one of the ways you get to those traps is you have to press different buttons, put the ignition on, press the defogger, press another button. And then all of a sudden, hydraulically, the whole part of the front dashboard will come forward, and you'll see either cocaine, you'll see cocaine, you'll see guns. And a lot of times they didn't know where to look. And we worked with guys who worked in the 3-4 precinct, and now we're a Major Case with us. And they knew, they pretty much kind of knew all these traps. And then actually we had an informant who was a trap specialist. So that was big for us to learn all the way they trap cars as well as apartments, So, yeah, I guess that's the answer to that one.
Yeah, I appreciate it. You answered great on both ones. And mine's is just real quick. I don't know if you knew him, but it did happen in Manhattan.
Who was that?
I was going to say, my question is just to round out the narcotics aspect was, I don't know if you knew him, but it did happen in Manhattan. March 10th, 1993, on an undercover buy and bust, Louis Lopez was shot and killed in the line of duty. I don't know if you knew him at all, but what do you remember from that day?
I don't know him, but I know I took it very hard because it's an undercover. And when I thought about it, one of the things that came to mind was, it's a miracle that more guys aren't killed, that I wasn't killed, that a lot of guys weren't killed. It just was amazing to me that we didn't have as many undercovers killed. And it was a sorrowful day, and it's just a bleak time for undercovers in general, especially those of us who were kind of gung-ho, and as Louis Lopez, was. And I think that we all realize that, it could end at any moment when you're an undercover. You don't have anybody really to back you up, especially if you're doing an inside buy in an apartment. Nobody's backing you up there. Your field team is, but they're a couple of blocks away,
Mm-hmm.
So I think it just, I don't like to take anything positive about the death of an undercover. I think Louis, the part that was, it's not positive, but the part that he left, the legacy behind, was, I think undercovers became even more, had their head on a swivel even more, and also were very, very careful about who they were buying from, and where and when they were making these buys. It did affect it, but I don't think that anybody dies in the line of duty without a lesson to be learned for everybody else. And I think we realize that, we don't want to be the next Louis. Nobody did.
No. And this was 5 years after Hoban and Busick were killed in the same day in separate incidents doing the same thing, undercover buys. And then this is 5 years before Sean Carrington was killed in the Bronx doing something similar in 1998. So getting back to, of course, your stint in SVU, and I'll even touch on homicide momentarily, is, of course, no sex crime is similar. As you said, sometimes these do involve minors, sometimes it's adult on adult, and it varies. But the common theme is it's very depraved to rob somebody of their dignity that way, no matter who you are and how you go about doing it. You kind of touched on it earlier, but I'll ask you again, especially when you're talking about how much the East Side Rapist case still bothers you. How do you cope? What helps you?
What helps me is teaching now. I've written a handbook that people can get on Amazon. You can read it for free if you have Kindle, I think. So I'm not making sales here. But I wrote a book on sex crimes investigation that I thought was small enough a detective go out on his first job and take it and utilize it for making a complete sex crimes investigation. And that's what I want to do. I want to leave something behind for others, because I put a lot of work, and it ripped apart my marriage. The amount of time I was away from home. Here I am spending time at the New York Academy of Medicine Library, the Columbia Presbyterian Psychiatric Library, and I'm not home. And I had little kids, and I remember one day I drove home and I saw my son playing football with the neighbor, and I was like, I don't know, for some reason it just hit me, because I wasn't playing football with them, and my kids, they didn't really know me, and my wife, who's a very good woman to this day, I love her, she's a great woman, but I drove a wedge in between. I didn't, I always said, well, I don't cheat on my wife, so I'm really good, yeah, that's great, but I did cheat on my wife with the job. The job was a mistress with me, and that's not something I say proudly. It's something that I say, like, you've had many other great cops on this show that I'll never even come close to being, but a lot of them knew how to handle their private lives and balance it. I didn't. I became you could say I became obsessed to some degree about just being the best. There was no second best wasn't good enough for me. And by best, I mean getting the real confession. Make sure I don't get a false confession. Uh, Make sure I know what a false report is. And that's something that I never wanted to mess up on a false report. I don't, well, I know to this day that I haven't messed up on. In other words, I accused somebody of lying. I wasn't lying because during the a false report, when you're going to arrest somebody for false report, prior to you arresting them, when you talk to them, you have to read them their rights at some point and say, now you're a suspect in a false report, which is a crime. You have the right, blah, blah, blah. You give them their rights. And everybody that I had signed them, but you would come back in a couple of minutes later and they might be crying or whatever. But those tactics, the false report tactics are a little bit different. Those things I learned from my partner, I learned on my own. But the interviewing of the offenders, I had one guy that wouldn't talk to me. I had another guy that was in Sing Sing as an inmate. He wouldn't talk to the 19th Precinct Squad. But I talked to him, and this is when I was a young detective. They brought him over. They were trying to take the collar, actually, but
of course,
I guess. And it should be assigned to special victims. But anyway, they brought it over, and they said, "Here's the guy. He's not going to say anything." So I'm a young detective. Nobody knows me. So I go in there, and I interview the guy. I talk about Sing Sing. I talk about Word of Honor. You know, a lot of it's, you know, kind of you're just going along with some stuff, you know, and trying to get the guy to go along with it. And he did. He felt. I mean, this guy was just out of jail, rock solid. He was just, and he connected with me somehow. And I said to him, he had sexually assaulted a lady and stole a car. So I said to him, well, what happened? And this is, you know, he explained to me what happened. He stole the car, blah, blah, blah. So I went outside and I said to the 19th Squad guys, I said, okay, I got a confession from him. And they're like, yeah, but there's one other thing. And she had a bracelet and we can't find that bracelet, blah, blah, blah. I said, hold on. I went back in. I talked to the guy. He told me where the bracelet was. Then we had the DA come up. The DA videoed the whole confession. So I knew at that point that if I talked to people like that, instead of yelling at them or screaming at them, that I would get somewhere. And I can tell you that I did get a good many confessions. I may not have been the best there, but I tried to be.
I would say you were. You were invested. It reminds me, I grew up a huge wrestling fan. And for those of you that watch wrestling, you may remember the wrestler Triple H. And there's a moment where he's being interviewed right before he became a main event star in 1999. And his character refers to himself as the Game, because he said in that interview with the announcer being Jim Ross, you guys talk about, the quote is, and I'm going to clean it up a little bit for the show, you guys talk about being students of the game. I am the effing game. You know, meaning that he was so invested in the business as you were talking about in your career. He lived and breathed it. It was him. But also, as you said, you know, there is a line to where, especially in that kind of work, if you invest yourself in it too much and you don't know when to pull back, it can hurt you. But I appreciate your candidness in talking about that, because who knows, sometimes, and I don't think this is the case, but I'm always proven wrong. I'll get an active MOS message me on Instagram or LinkedIn or Twitter. I listen to your show. I appreciate you talking to these guys and gals. Stuff like that could help them as they start out in their careers. Yeah,
and I hope they do. I hope that they go to the Amazon to take a look at my book, The Complete Guide to Sex Crimes Investigation. Not making a sale. They can read it free on Kindle, I think, now. It's a good book. It's a little handbook. It's not long, guys. It's not a textbook or anything. But you look at it, and I'll tell you from the beginning to the end, and I'm very proud of that book because, like I said, that's why I'm talking about it now. I think people can learn from it. I want to leave something. There's a retired deputy chief in the fire department, probably the most famous fire chief in the world, Vincent Dunn.
Yes.
I don't know if you've interviewed him, Mike, but
I've tried to get him on. He declined, unfortunately for me.
Okay, well, I'll talk to him. He was my father's boss in 58 Engine. Anyway, the reason I wrote him a letter recently, or a little message recently, and I said the reason that I studied so much and learned so much about, especially special victims, is because of him and because of my father. My dad always told me, he said, always be around people that are smarter than you, which I always try to do, and always learn more than the boss. Don't let them know that. Don't tell them that you know more, but always know more than the boss if you can about a particular subject. Now, I work with some great bosses. You're talking about John Cutter, you're talking about Louis Animo, and you're talking about guys who are top notch guys, and those guys were great in and of themselves. But I tried to associate myself with detectives like Irma Rivera, John Savino, Jimmy Flaherty, people like that who I highly respect. And it rubbed off on me. I mean, I remember one case when I was first there. It was a child abuse case. It was in Harlem Hospital. And look, Irma was in a child abuse unit at the time within our unit. But I handled mostly, rape cases. But if there were child abuse cases that came up, we handled them. So I wasn't used to it or anything. But I remember asking Irma, I said, maybe you can give me a hand with this if you don't mind or whatever. And boom, away she went, and she was great. And I learned a lot just from that one investigation that she did. I learned so much about how to talk to kids and so forth. And it helped me. It helped me a great deal, to listen to what my father said, and to listen. Mike. One more thing, I want to go back to 3-2 again. I want to tell you something. One of the things I learned from 3-2 and 3-2 cops, a lot of those nuggets of information. One thing was, you chase the guy down, because one time I chased the guy down, and I'm ready to take a punch at him. Not. I wasn't thinking. What am I doing? And a 3-2 cop came up to me the old time. He said, "Listen, kid," he says, "when he's down on the ground, you got him. He's the bad guy. You're the good guy. Done. There's no need for any of that." I had a sergeant who told me who to pull over if you're going to give a ticket to somebody. He says, if the guy's got a job, he's looking for a job, he's in the service, he's got a kid in the car, don't give him a ticket, and I just little things added up, and they influenced my career. But one of the things I will tell you is there was about three things that really were driven into my head by my father, and I brought to the 3-2 and the job was never hurt somebody unless they're hurting you, and I've had to do that before. Don't take anything from the bad guys. Don't take anything from the bad guys, and tell the truth. And it sounds simple advice, right? But it works. It works, and it made the job a lot easier, especially when you can go to court and you're not trying to, make up something or trying to explain yourself away. Just tell the truth. I had a trial with a guy who's still in jail now. I actually looked him up the other day. Talk about obsession, right? He's still in jail for something I arrested him for, which was rape and sodomy, brutal rapist. Anyway, he when we went to the trial with the case, I thought I had myself put together, but he had one of these he had a private defense attorney. He's very, very good. And he asked me something about it. I can't even remember what it was to this day, but it was something small, but something I didn't do. And I admitted to him, I said, I should have done it. I didn't do it. And in the end, he was convicted and sentenced like 275 years consecutively or something like that. He's
Jesus.
Never getting out of jail. And the defense attorney came up to me and shook my hand. That means something to a special victims detective, or any detective, really. Or when you're riding in an elevator with your partner, in this case, John Savino, at the lab, you used to be at 20th Street, and you're going down in the elevator with the lady that does hairs and fibers, and you know her because you got hairs and fibers all the time, right? And you know this lady so well that she's doing a side study on knots. She did it on her own. She was studying different kinds of knots, right? And she looked at us, we had just put evidence in to the property property clerk up there in the evidence section, and she said, "You know what? If I get raped, I want one of you two guys investigating it." That's the highest. That's the highest. Salute you can get, the highest regard you can get from somebody is I'm saying that to you.
I'll say.
Still means a lot to me.
As it should.
Yeah.
As it should. So you mentioned you broke your leg, and that led to, unfortunately, you having to end your career prematurely in 2000. And of course, a few years passed by, department changes a lot, 9/11 happens. And then Joint Terrorism Task Force becomes the premier task force in the NYPD to be a part of. And that brings you out to Florida, where, that's basically the sixth borough. So many New Yorkers go down there, either one of the two Carolinas. And you went down there and you got back into law enforcement. But just tell me, before I get to the part of your brief stint as a sheriff's deputy, those 4 years, do you feel it was therapeutic? Did you feel that you were able to recharge your batteries, as bittersweet as it was to end your career prematurely?
Yeah, I mean, I had done some consulting work, but not much. So yeah, I think it was therapeutic to get those years. I didn't go out on my own terms. I didn't ask for retire. I didn't get 3/4 pay. They put me out. So yeah, it took me some time to you lose your of course I identified completely as a cop, especially special victims cop, and I wasn't there nearly as long as the other people that were there, but that's how I identify myself. I lost my identity for a while, then I decided, well, let me try to be a cop down in Florida, because I moved down. My parents were down here. I decided to come on down, and I joined up with the sheriff. And at first, I didn't have a police officer position, and luckily, when I transferred down, I had qualified for both correction and police, because I was correction officer Sing Sing, so they accepted that. So they said, well, you can make the same amount of money. You can work in jail for a little bit, and then when a road position opens, you can go there. So I said, good, I'll make the money. Okay. So I went and I worked in jail for a little bit there. And I thought I enjoyed my time in there, because that was me being the best cop I could, correction officer I could be. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed the time I spent there and the respect that I got from not only my peers, but the inmates. And then I went on patrol, and I enjoyed every moment of it. I enjoyed the people I work with, but I did things a little differently than most of the deputies did down there. I brought a little levity to the situation. And if I could give you an example,
Sure.
I'll keep it clean. But there was a woman who she was mentally disturbed, and she wouldn't go with the police. She refused to be handcuffed, and I was in my training period. But my training officer knew I was a cop already and stuff. So, but he said he knew that I could talk to people. He said, go over there and work your mojo on that lady there. Talk to her. I said, all right. But these guys, they were deputies. They had the taser and the red light pointed at her. And, maybe now I'm like thinking, wow, this is way different than New York. This is like tactical mindset here. But I went up to the lady and I knelt down next to her and I just said, don't worry about it. I said, these are hillbillies here. I'm from New York. And I did say that. Nobody heard me. That was good. But I told them, I said, and I told her, I said, listen, let me talk to you for a minute. All right. And she seemed like a real nice person and stuff. I said, but let me ask you something. I said, have you ever seen the TV show Gilligan's Island, where they're stranded on the island? She goes, of course I've seen that. I said, well, did you ever ask yourself how it was that the professor could make a record player out of a coconut, but he couldn't fix a friggin' hole in the boat? And that's obviously it's a joke, right? And she just started cracking up laughing at it, right? And if you've seen Gilligan's Island, I guess you would. You might laugh. I thought it was funny. She laughed, and I said, "You know what? If I put the cuffs on and get you in the back, we'll get you some help. What do you think?" She was like, "Yeah, no problem." Boom, cuffs on, put her in the back, and that's it. So you're talking about the mojo. My training office called mojo, so I like that. But you're talking about using that on people. I mean, I had a guy one time that was there, and he was gonna, he had a gun. He was gonna kill himself, and I was, I guess down in Florida they call me reckless, but I would walk up to the guy and be like, "Listen, let's talk. I've had problems with the old lady. I know what you're talking about. Whatever it was that I could do." And in fact, Mike, an interesting thing was one time I had a guy who was suicidal, but he didn't want the cops taking him. He was paranoid or whatever. He didn't want the cops taking him to the mental health facility. So I went in and he saw me and he even recognized me from the jail. And he said, "I remember you, Baeza, from the jail. Well, you're on patrol, right?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "What do you say we talk together alone for a second and we'll tell everybody just to give us space?" I had a corporal at the corporal all the time, and I told him, "Can you get the guys back and we just talk to this guy?" So I talked to him and I said, "Listen, you don't want to go into cop car. We want to get you help. How about if your mother drives you and I follow in your car? And the other cars will stay back. I'll follow you and I'll go." And he was like, "All right, I'll do that." I said, "Okay." So he did it. We got him over there and, he got help. And then the corporal, he was a pretty good guy. He tried to write me up for like a medal or whatever, and they denied it immediately because they said, "Oh, he didn't follow procedure and blah, blah, blah." And I was like, "Don't worry about it. I got enough medals from the NYPD. I don't need medals from here, But we did have a couple of interesting cases down here. I did have a attempted murder collar that I made. A guy shot. It was a shots fired call, which you never hear down where I was in Florida. Never heard a shot. So shots fired. So I went to the location. There was an old lady. There was shots fired in the house behind me. So we went down. We look over the fence and we see this guy, and he's got the gun pointed right at the lady who's on her knees, and he says, "I got one more for you," and he used the expletive. And at that point, we lit him up with lights. A couple of guys were with me, and I told him, I said, "Listen, stop, put the gun down and do this, do that." And he got down on his knees and so forth, but he had just fired a shot at her, and it was about a foot away from her head. A 45 shot. So we went in there, we arrested him, and I go and I tell the sergeant, I said, "Listen, we're going to need to get a search warrant here, to search it." He goes, "We don't do that here." He said, "You just get consent from the guy." I goes, "The guy's kind of drunk," but anyway, so I did, I got consent from the guy, talked to him. And long story short, the sergeant, I said to the sergeant, "Major crimes has to get this now, right? The detectives." He goes, "No, you did this stuff in New York, right?" I said, "Well, yeah." He says, "Okay, you do it with the crime scene person." They had forensic personnel. So I did the crime scene and everything was set. And the next day I said to myself, "You know what? I'm going to request his phone calls from when he was in booking because they're recorded. I want to hear what he has to say to this girl." And he threatened her with harm and all kinds of stuff. And I went to one of they don't call them ADAs, they call them like state's attorney down here. But I went to one of them. I said, "Listen, I got this." And he's like, the first time he ever got a recording from anybody or anything. And he's like, "Okay, we got to go to the judge." Turns out the guy was released. And, I'm not going to say the name or anything, but he worked for a big gold and jewelry store down there. And I think there was some influence that was used to get him out. But anyway, that was that guy could have shot that woman. She was on her knees. I mean, before he even saw us, he was pointing the gun and making that statement at her. So, and he had just recently fired at her head. So I thought we did a good job there. We all did, So
I would say.
but there came a time. Here's one of the things I'll tell you about. My whole career, I never gave out a speeding ticket, and that won't surprise most New York City cops, especially ghetto cops, because you're not doing any kind of speed violations or anything like that. You know, highway cops do that.
Right. Unless you got somebody going 95 through the streets, then you're
Right.
not
I mean,
hand
if you
out.
have reckless or whatever, but I never gave any kind of speeding ticket out in my whole career. So when I was in a deputy sheriff, I'd give out warnings galore. Sometimes I'd have people come to me, and after a warning, I'd have them look at mugshots. I had people wanted for robbery and stuff like that, and sometimes they would help me out. Sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would. I'd find somebody, but I didn't give out those types of tickets. Now let me explain the work I did. Maybe people find this interesting. I don't know, but around 2 a.m., everything's dead there. So what I did was I made a list of all non-drug felonies like robbery, burglary, all those who are wanted. And I knew the warrant squad only worked 9 to 5. So they weren't catching anybody. So I'd have my list ready. I'd do it in the morning or whatever. I have my list ready, and I go out at night. One time I filled the back seat with, we had a cage. Like in New York City when I started, we didn't have a cage or anything, but we had a cage. I had to borrow handcuffs. I had 4 guys in the back. You could make arrests because you just drop them off, fill out a little form, drop them off, and the corrections part of it, they take care of everything else. So you could make 8 collars a night. So that's what I did. And I was like number 1 in arrest on the west side of the county that I was working in. I was not number 1. I was number 2. Number 1 was a DWI guy. I could never catch him, but I know I was number 2. So I was making my arrest, and we have a 5-man squad. One guy works tickets, and I'd mess with him sometimes. He'd be at the top of the hill trying to get people, and I'd pull down where he couldn't see me, and I flip my lights on. I'd sit there for a few minutes, and people slow down, and it was just kind of screw with the guy a little bit. He'd come in the morning, goes, I can't get any speeding tickets or whatever. I wouldn't say nothing, But one day I got called in, and this is the end. We're going to the end of my deputy career. There's not too much to it, but I had put in for detectives. It had been approved, and but what happens there is a detective is not. It's not like the NYPD, the Gold Shield. It's not like that. It's like one day a guy could be working patrol, next day he's a deputy, next day he's a corporal, next day he's working patrol again. There was no continuity. There was no being a detective there didn't mean that much to me. Like the NYPD was everything to me. So I decided, you know what? I think I had enough of humping these calls and running around after a couple of years, 3 years. So, well, just prior to that, this is what caused it. I got called into the lieutenant's office, right? And I'm like, why am I getting called in? I didn't do anything wrong or whatever. So I get called in, and he goes, do you know why you're here? And I go, I called him Lou, even down there. I called him Lou. I go, Lou, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know. He goes, well, because you haven't given out any moving violations. I said, well, I said, you know what? That's not really what I do. I said, we have a guy in the squad that does it. I do the arrest. He goes, I know about your arrest. He goes, but you're not getting any revenue. You're not giving any tickets out or anything. And I said, okay, that's fine. And after that, I was like, you know what? I'm done. I've had my time. I'm done. So I gave my notice, and that was it. And I left with a good reputation. So, and in honor. So I was happy about that. And then, then I wanted to do other things, teach, lecture a lot in Mexico and stuff on sex crimes and so forth. And that's kind of what I did. It was an exciting career. I don't know if people who watch the show think it was that exciting, but for me, it was an exciting career from 18 years old, all the way up till now. I'm still on top of the literature. In fact, today I just got a book in the mail. the pathology of asphyxiation. See, I get the latest books, and I still get the latest articles and so forth. I keep myself up to date on all that stuff. So I'm still, I got a library worth probably about $8,000 with forensic books and textbooks and stuff in it. So, that's me in a nutshell. And I hope, your viewers got something out of it. I hope if there are cops out there, they got something out of it. I hope so.
For those of you in the audience, and this is why I always laugh with these guys, because it's FD guys and PD guys too that do this. They say before the show, I don't know if I got that many stories. I don't know if I'm that interesting. Look at all the stories this man told in almost an hour and a half. They always say that. Anytime they say that, I know they're BSing. I know I'm going to get a great show. It's the guys that say, oh, you're not going to believe the stuff I did. Those are the boring ones. Not that I've had that. But the ones that always want to play it humble, exactly. Pete Pranzo just had an excellent career, John. Be proud.
Well, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Mike, and I appreciate it. And I'm blessed to have a healthy family, and I'm gonna leave part of me behind, whatever I can, so that others can learn. And I think that's my meaning in life, really, at this point.
We'll end as we always end, and that is the rapid fire. It's the 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Manhattan as a borough is great, but it's got a lot of great little neighborhoods within it. Soho, NoHo, Harlem, so on and so forth. Favorite neighborhood within the borough alone?
I'd have to say the Upper West Side.
I don't blame you. Good place. Good place. Second, either in Florida or in New York, or even as a correctional officer, funniest call or incident you ever handled?
Well, this was in a 3-2. I got a call of a dispute. When I got there, there was there were 2 lesbians that had a dispute, domestic dispute. One was 6 foot tall, 6'2", really tall, and I'm pretty short. I'm about 5'7" if I stretch it. And the other was, I don't want to use the wrong word. You use height challenge. Sometimes I use
dwarf.
The word dwarf. Yeah, with a wooden leg. Okay, and now their argument was not over something very serious. It was over something like who's going to use the microwave, or it was something like that, or whatever. Who's going to cook the dinner or whatever? And it was just, I had to hold it. And after the call, that's when we just laughed. Me and my partner, we just blurted out laughing, and it was so funny. I mean, granted, it's a dispute, and we took that seriously, but afterwards it was just like, oh my gosh. And I actually one time went on, there was a homicide that I went on as a patrol officer, and the argument, the father and son, the son wanted to watch Tom and Jerry, and the father wanted to watch Oprah Winfrey. And I guess the son got his way because he killed the father.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, I mean, just some strange things. So sorry.
God, I'll say. Third, funniest colleagues you ever worked with?
Oh, like right away, Joe Guida from Narcotics. He still works with me. In private business. Eddie O'Callahan. I hope he's out there listening somewhere. He was hilarious. Guy from Special Victims. I knew. Those 2 guys would come to mind. Yeah.
Fourth, whenever John Baeza is back in New York City, what's the first bar or restaurant he's got to stop at?
It would be Coogan's, but I think it's up by the 3-4. But I'm told that they might have closed. They might be closing it down. Mm-hmm. That would be everybody knows that bar, I think, in Manhattan North. Coogan's, and the other was a bar that was very well unknown. It was when sex crimes was out of the 2-0 precinct. It was called the Snug. It was this tiny little bar, and I'm not a drinker really, so I get free Pepsi or Coke or whatever. I'm a designated sober guy, but I had fun there.
And fifth and finally, the job has changed a lot through the years. You've certainly seen that firsthand, and you're teaching a lot now. But not just on sex crimes, just in general. You get somebody that's just coming on the job. what advice would you give them?
Well, if they're on the job already, I told you I'd be honest, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I will be honest. My advice to them would be do as little time as possible and try to get onto another job, all different than law enforcement. If somebody was looking for a job in law enforcement, I tell them that right now what I would do is I would join the fire department. It's considered the best job in the world. Now, I didn't want to be a fireman. I love my father was a fireman. My uncle was a battalion chief. He was a cop before that. But I think I would tell people to join the fire department.
That's what's called the rollover in New York, where it counts towards your pension all the same. Guys, I know quite a few guys that did that. They started out as cops, and then as soon as the fire department test opened up, they went and they became New York City firemen. And ain't nothing wrong with that. Christian Flood, my buddy's in the chat, he said FDNY second to none, when he was on the show, and he sums it up best. He says, and this goes for the FD and the PD in New York, front seat to the greatest show on earth.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
This was a lot of fun. Stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. Besides your books, of course, which I'll link in the description once I edit this later. Is there anything else you want to give a shout out to?
No, just all the cops that you've interviewed, and you had some very, very heavy hitters. Not only cops, but non-cops. I saw Bob Costas and so forth. I mean, just unbelievable. Your show is great. There's a shout out to you. And to shout out to all the people that I know out there. Hopefully they're watching or they get to see this. I love you guys. You helped me become who I was. So it's not like I'm some great person. You guys helped me a lot. And a special shout out to John Savino, Irma Rivera, Jim Flaherty, and three more bosses. John Cutter, Chief Cutter, Chief Anamone, and my sergeant in Special Victims, Sergeant Eugene Wazlowski. Those were just great men.
Thank you, John. Like I said, stick around. We'll say goodbye off the air. And thanks to everybody that tuned in tonight. Coming up next in the Mike the New Haven podcast, two very interesting shows, both with detectives. One was a detective in the Port Authority Police, went out to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. That's Tom McHale. His travels took him to the Middle East on some interesting investigations. So look forward to that. That's Monday at 8 o'clock. I moved up the hour because for those of you that are friends over from Getting Salty, they don't have a show Monday. So I'll be filling that slot. I'll be live at 8 o'clock. So come on for Tom McHale. That'll be an interesting show. And then he started out in the New York City Housing Police. It's going to be on Tuesday. And then after 8 years there, went on to the NYPD upon the merge. In 2001, after 14 years between both agencies, he went to the ATF, where he spent the next 20 years. So interesting guy, 14 years in the NYPD side / housing police side, then 20 years as a Fed. And that's Pete Forcelli, who also has a book coming out pretty soon that we'll talk about when he comes on. In the meantime, on behalf of retired NYPD Detective John Baeza, I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Have a great weekend, everybody. Take care of yourselves. Stay safe.